Let's talk about the name of God. On one hand, we could say the names of God because God has many different names, and all of these different names usually are based upon the generic word for God, Elohim. A few are based upon his actual name. We cannot do in this context a list of all the names and all the studies. That would be a separate study altogether, but we're going to focus on God's actual name. Now keep in mind, his name is a Hebrew name, and the Hebrew name comprises 4 Hebrew letters, Yud, He, Vav, He. It will correspond to our Latin letters as YHWH. YHWH. Now, the Jewish people, after return from Babylon, became very sensitive to the Mosaic law, and among the commandments is, you will not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. And so they're afraid to pronounce the name, and quit pronouncing it. And in fact, it was allowed to be said only one time of year by the high priest on the Day of Atonement, when the high priest entered the Holy of Holies of the Jewish temple. Only on that day alone, would the name be pronounced. And because the language of Hebrew does not have vowel pointings, we're not 100% sure what the correct pronunciation was. The most educated guess is that it was pronounced Yahweh. Yahweh. There's a chance it was pronounced Yihye, but the most logical and educated guess, it was pronounced Yahweh. So in all probability, not 100% sure, but in all probability, that would have been the pronunciation. And the Jewish sensitivity has been passed down in many English translations. For example, in most English Bibles, when it's God's name with those 4 letters being used, English would read in all caps, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, Lord. That follows the Jewish practice because the Jews would not pronounce the name, they use substitutes. The most common substitute is Adonai, meaning Lord. Sometimes they say a different substitute, Hashem, meaning the name. Sometimes they'll combine the two, Adoshem, the Lord of the name. And English Bibles have tended to follow that procedure. Now, substitute that was used by another group of people, and these are the Germans. They decided to try to get as close as they can, and what they did was take those 4 Hebrew letters, and they came out with the letters of JHWH. JHWH. Why a J? Because in German, the letter J is pronounced like a Y. In English, it's pronounced like a J, but in German, it's a Y, so it corresponds to the Hebrew equivalent. So in our language, it'd be YHWH. In German, it is JHWH. Now, because the Hebrews not have the vowel pointings, what they did was take the vowel pointings of the word Adonai, Lord, and that's how the term Jehovah came into being. And when Jehovah came into English, the J became a J sound, and that's why in English we say Jehovah. But in German, it was Jehovah, the German equivalent of Yahweh, which is closest to the actual original. They have Jehovah's Witnesses that would make claims such as the Jews don't pronounce that name and therefore deny the God's name, deny his true character, but that's missing the point. They will simply have such a high respect for the name of God that they chose not to pronounce it except during the Day of Atonement in the temple area. Furthermore, when Jehovah's Witnesses calls God's name Jehovah, they got it wrong. If they really want to be accurate, it would be Yahweh's Witnesses. Yahweh Witnesses, but they don't say that. They're using an anglicized equivalent of the German substitute. So they're going to claim the Jewish people denied their God because they don't pronounce the name. Well, the way Jehovah's Witnesses pronounce the name is totally wrong. His name is not Jehovah. His name is Yahweh. Jehovah is just an anglicized equivalent to the German equivalent. So they make a big to-do about that name, but they get it wrong. So if they follow their own logic, by not calling him Yahweh, but calling him Jehovah, they're denying the reality of that God themselves, which is what they accuse the Jewish people of doing. And that's the fallacy in their thinking. But biblically, the issue is not how you pronounce the name. The issue is, do you know the meaning of the name? And that's the final verdict. And therefore we have Even Jehovah's Witnesses call him Jesus, but his name in Hebrew is Yeshua, not Jesus. So they have these kinds of makeshift illogical statements, but they're missing the whole boat. What is the meaning of Yahweh? It comes from the Hebrew root to me, to be, or to be self-existent. To be or to be self-existent. And this is the self-existing God who's always been from eternity past. From the very beginnings of beginnings, he was always there. And that's the meaning of the actual word, the actual name. But the meaning of the usage of the name is emphasizing God as the covenant keeper. And so we call him Yahweh, Jehovah, or Lord in all caps. It emphasizes him as the covenant-keeping God. By the same token, it's not Jesus, but Yeshua. Yeshua comes from the Hebrew root to save, and they called him Yeshua because he will Hoshea his people from their sins. You call him Yeshua because he will save his people from their sins. The important thing is not how you pronounce the name, Yeshua, Jesus, Jesus, or some other form. The issue is, do you understand the meaning of the name? And then the importance of knowing the meaning and how we have to respond to it. And by believing that Yahweh is the self-existing one, the covenant-keeping God, we can trust him to keep every promise he makes. And by calling him Jesus, Yeshua, whatever, we're saying we're trusting this one person for our salvation, no one else and nothing else.